Welcome, everyone. As a senior economic advisor, I am absolutely thrilled to welcome all of you, our local policymakers and budget managers, to this high-level briefing. Today's explainer, well, it's focused on something that probably keeps a lot of us awake at night: sustainable infrastructure spending and fiscal discipline. We're going to look really closely at a fascinating study out of Ghana that offers some profound, data-driven lessons for developing nations all across the globe. So let's just start right off with a huge paradox. Why does borrowing for infrastructure, money specifically intended to build roads, hospitals, power grids, why does that sometimes actually shrink our economy? Now, we all know developing nations need to borrow to grow, but as you'll see in this research, without the right institutional checks in place, public debt can literally stifle GDP growth instead of stimulating it. Crazy, right? Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, Ghana's debt history timeline. 2. The structural equation tool. 3. Bureaucracy, debt, and growth. 4. Curbing corrupt infrastructure spending. And finally, number 5, the policymaker's practical toolkit. Section 1. Ghana's debt history timeline, a cycle of borrowing and relief. To really grasp how we need to manage our fiscal responsibilities today, we absolutely have to look back at the historical cycles that developing nations like Ghana have navigated. As budget managers, context is everything, right? Back in 1983, Ghana accepted a really stringent economic recovery policy under the IMF and World Bank, and it worked. It successfully restored stability and growth. But then, look at 1992. An election-year spending spike severely disrupted revenue sources, and that caused domestic debt to absolutely surge. Fast forward to 2000, and debt hit a staggering 80% of GDP. That actually led Ghana to sign on to the HIPC, or Heavily Indebted Poor Countries, initiative, which provided some massive relief. But here's the kicker. Even with that relief, persistent expenditure overruns and deep structural issues meant Ghana's debt to GDP was projected to cross right back over that 80% mark by late 2022. It's just this relentless cycle, borrowing, relief, and borrowing all over again. Moving on to Section 2, the structural equation tool, diagnosing the fiscal plumbing. We aren't just looking at isolated numbers today. We're using a comprehensive diagnostic tool to understand exactly how the fiscal plumbing is behaving. Now, what's really interesting here is the methodology. The researchers use something called structural equation modeling, or SEM. And I know, a path analysis diagram might look like a bunch of abstract math, but just think of it as a blueprint of your economy. It lets us evaluate complex, simultaneous relationships. We're measuring both direct and indirect links between government expenditure, institutional quality, and debt, all at the exact same time. It's so much better than just looking at one variable in a vacuum. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole concept. If we just think about it like city plumbing, imagine GDP as our main water reservoir. The pipes feeding water into this reservoir, those represent public debt, recurrent expenditure, and trade openness. But before that water can safely fill the reservoir, it has to go through a filtration system. That filter is your bureaucracy. It controls the water pressure, directs the flow to capital projects, and ideally catches any leaks. But listen, if the filter is dirty or the pipes are broken, it really doesn't matter how much water or debt you pump in. The reservoir simply won't fill. All right, Section 3, bureaucracy, debt, and growth. What the data actually tells us. Let's step away from the plumbing analogy for a second and look at the actual empirical findings from the Ghanaian dataset between 1990 and 2019. The hard data reveals a pretty surprising reality. A lot of people just assume borrowing always equals growth, right? But the path analysis shows that accumulating public debt actually negatively affects GDP growth in this context. Get this, the data showed a 10% increase in public debt caused GDP growth to fall by over 6%. No way, right? On the flip side, trade openness and, surprisingly, recurrent expenditure, things like wages and operational costs, actually proved to be positive predictors. They boosted GDP. But what about capital expenditure? The big money we borrow specifically to build large infrastructure? Well, this brings us to the double-edged sword of bureaucratic quality. The researchers found that better bureaucracy generally improves the overall economic environment. It provides a nice little boost to overall GDP growth. But paradoxically, it actually has a significant negative impact on capital expenditure. Now, how in the world can higher bureaucratic quality shrink capital spending? The researchers point out that while the overall system might look stable on paper, those complex bureaucratic layers often create specialized little avenues for rent-seeking in the public sector procurement system. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, curbing corrupt infrastructure spending, stopping the leaks. This is where we, as budget managers, really need to focus our magnifying glass to figure out exactly why capital expenditure is shrinking. So the crucial point is summarized perfectly by the authors. Quote, asymmetry information and imperfect monitoring give room for bureaucrats to circumvent policies through bribes, kickbacks, tender manipulation. Going back to our plumbing analogy, this is exactly where the pipes burst. When elected officials delegate massive procurement tasks to bureaucrats without really strict, transparent monitoring, it just creates this environment where funds meant for infrastructure are quietly siphoned off for personal benefit. So here are the specific red flags you absolutely need to monitor. The researchers noted that infrastructure delivery is often plagued by embezzlement, fraud, and tender manipulation. Conflict of interest. That's a massive drain. On top of that, a large, unmonitored informal sector severely limits tax collection, which of course pushes the government to just borrow even more. And perhaps the most visibly tragic thing for economic growth, abandoned infrastructural projects. Money is spent, debt is accrued, but the bridge or the hospital is never actually finished. That means it generates literally zero economic return to help pay off the very debt that funded it. All right, Section 5. The Policymaker's Practical Toolkit, Actionable Strategies for Budget Managers. We've got our diagnosis. Now let's move from the problem to the solution and talk about direct, actionable strategies to ensure strict fiscal discipline. Let's move to and see how this builds into some rapid-fire, data-driven recommendations. First, we absolutely must broaden the tax base to create fiscal space rather than just deepening it on the folks already paying. Relying on taxes is just way more sustainable than borrowing to fund the budget deficit. Second, and this is huge, complete existing capital projects. Stop starting new builds until you finish the old ones. Completing projects ensures those investments actually serve their economic purpose instead of just feeding rent-seeking behavior. Third, we need to enhance procurement transparency. We have got to reduce bureaucratic discretion to eliminate those bribes and kickbacks. And fourth, support local industries to boost exports. The data overwhelmingly showed trade openness as a massive driver of GDP growth. I want to leave you with this final, really provocative thought. Think about this. If we only borrow to build, but never monitor the builders, are we simply financing our own economic decline? As local policymakers and government officials, your role isn't just to secure funding for the next big, flashy project. Your primary duty is to ensure the institutional quality, the oversight, and the fiscal discipline required to make sure every single dollar actually reaches the concrete it was intended for. This explainer was built on the incredible research from the paper Investigating Institutional and Expenditure Patterns on Debt and Economic Growth in Ghana by Sediga, IEC, Abdulrahman, and Baho Boteng, published in 2024. I want to sincerely thank all of you for joining this advisory briefing today. Go out there, use this toolkit, monitor those pipes, and let's start building real sustainable growth.